All right, good morning. Welcome to, I think this is session 12 of Understanding LDS History, where we are looking at the pioneer years of 1844 to 1877 together. I appreciate you being here this morning. As always, I just want to share at the beginning, and that whether you are LDS and you're watching this online or in this class, or you're an evangelical believer, that we all believe in the truth of 1 Peter 3:15 and 16. And in all the areas that we may differ, and they are important, and they are pretty major differences, that our goal and my goal in this class, and I don't know how well I always pull it off, but my goal is that I want to share the hope that I have in Jesus, but to do so with gentleness and respect. And we can disagree without being disagreeable. And if you are watching this and you may disagree, I would love to sit down and have a cup of coffee, and we can work through our disagreements, but we can do so in a way that honors Jesus. And so my goal is, I hope I can pull it off every week. I want to be gracious in my speech as we look at some very important issues together. So we had left off a couple weeks ago. 1845 in Nauvoo was a big year for the Mormons. Brigham's first full year after he and the apostles had taken over control following the death of Joseph Smith. And you might remember, a lot happened in that 1 year. The city had grown to over 12,000 people, nearly all of whom were members of the church. And they continued to experience opposition from their neighbors and the people in the neighboring cities who were bound and determined that they not be there. And by the end of that year, they had begun to raid and burn all of the outlying Mormon settlements and farms, and everybody had fallen back into Nauvoo. And they reached an agreement with the government and the local officials that, hey, if you'll leave us alone, we promise we'll leave by April of 1846. And so they reached that agreement. The big thing that Brigham had been waiting on before leaving is, right, we want to finish the temple so we can start temple ceremonies and start the endowments. And so the temple was finally completed in November of 1845. And between November of 1845 and January of 1846, over 5,000 people went through the temple to receive their endowments. And that includes the endowment ceremony, marriages being sealed, all of those kinds of things. And for a lot of these saints who had they'd sacrificed years of blood, sweat, and toil to see the temple completed at a cost of millions of dollars in 1845 dollars, millions of dollars, almost all of which was through the donations of church members, most of whom had very little to donate. Right? Most everybody was poor. And so they had scraped and sacrificed to see the temple completed. And so for a lot of those early saints that went through the temple and received the endowment, which they had been talking about for years, when the temple's done, we'll have the endowment. It's going to be this life-changing spiritual event. For a lot of those first saints that went through, they did find it to be a very rewarding thing. Norton Jacobs said this: we'll get to know him a lot in the days ahead. He's a valuable source for us today. He was an early saint, but he was part of the vanguard group, the initial group that made the trip to Salt Lake City, and he kept a very detailed diary of that entire journey. And so we'll be hearing from him again in the weeks ahead. But he said regarding going through the temple for the first time that it was the most interesting scene of all of my life, and one that afforded the most peace and joy that we had ever experienced since we were married, talking about being sealed to his wife. So a lot of people found it to be this profound religious experience, but not everybody did. And there were those who, because there had been so much buildup, right? So much buildup to, we got to have the temple, we got to finish the temple, and then you're going to receive this endowment, and then you're going to receive power from on high. That it was built up that so many people, some people when they went through it, went, really? That's it? That's what we've been waiting so long for. And I don't know, maybe it was like if you've ever had the experience of, sometimes a movie takes off, right? And everybody's telling you, you got to see it, you got to see it, you got to see it. And it gets so built up that you finally, when you go see the movie, you're kind of like, it was all right. And that was the experience that some had in going through the endowment ceremony. And I ran across this account. And if you'll bear with me, I found it so fascinating that I thought I'd take a few minutes to share it. One of those people was a lady named Catherine Lewis, who wrote this book in 1848 after she had left the church. You can find it online. It's not real long. If you wanted to go read it, you could probably sit down and read the entire book in 30 minutes or an hour about her experience with the church. But she was a convert living in Boston in the early 1840s. And she began to have misgivings about the church for the first time when she began to hear all these rumors about plural marriage. And remember, even in 1845 and 1846, they're not publicly acknowledging it. And polygamy is only being practiced still at that point by largely the apostles and other people that they have approached about it and brought into it. But it's been very selective. And she begins to hear rumors about it in Boston. That bugged her. And she was encouraged to become a plural wife by Augusta Adams Cobb Young. That's a name, a long name. But Augusta Young had become a plural wife of Brigham Young. And she was visiting Boston and had this conversation with Catherine only after swearing her to secrecy. She said, I got something to tell you, but you got to promise to keep it a secret. And she said, I can't promise to keep anything a secret if I don't know what it is, but okay. So eventually, Augusta did confide in her. She told her this, that the plurality of wives is true. And I brought an invitation to you from one of the 12, and don't refuse. For you know not what you will lose if you do. If you're not satisfied with him, here are 2 others. You can have your choice of either. They stand higher than he does. And if you take either of these, you will be highly exalted, and all of your friends, both dead and living, will be benefited thereby. So you need to do this. And remember that early teaching, and even today, this idea of being exalted, right? You need to do this. And especially for the women early on, because you've got to be tied to a man, to a husband, to gain exaltation. And, right, you and all of your family, right, even your dead relatives and baptism for the dead, they can be part of that kingdom that will be his when he is exalted. And so she's like, you don't know what you're going to lose if you don't do this. And so you need to. And she was very hesitant to do so. A little later, Heber Kimball and his wife, Violet, stayed with Catherine when they were in Boston for a conference. And they tried to convince her of the validity of plural marriage, and she still refused to concede. And so finally, here's what Catherine did. And think about the reality of this in the 1840s. She wasn't convinced of the necessity of plural marriage or that it was really something that was from of God. But she had heard so much about the endowment and the temple that's being built, that she just decided to move to Nauvoo. She had all of her things shipped, and she moved to Nauvoo for the purpose of being there when the temple was finished so that she could go through the endowment ceremony. And that if it was as profound as they were saying it was going to be, maybe that would help her to see that she needed to get on board with plural marriage. And so she did. She moved to Nauvoo. And while they were waiting for her things to arrive, she initially stayed with the Kimballs, who tried to sway her to their opinion again. And Heber actually told her, when the temple is done, my wife will come forward and give you to me, for she likes you. So Violet's already signed off on this. And so you should get on board. Catherine said, at that time, the elders taught publicly, whoever went to Nauvoo and received an endowment in the temple would witness such a manifestation of the power of God which could not be doubted. And that's what she was hoping for. That's why she had moved there. I'm going to experience something that's going to convince me of the reality of all of this. The keys of the priesthood would be given, and things which had been hidden from the foundation of the world would then be revealed and made known. So she was really hoping this endowment would provide some clarity for her that she didn't have before. Long story short, she went through the endowment and was not impressed. She found the whole thing kind of silly, and I think a lot were, there's a sense of, from my perspective, of the emperor's new clothes kind of deal with the endowment, right? Where, right, everybody can see the emperor's naked, but nobody wants to say it. And I think there is a lot of that kind of buildup that, right, everybody's expectation is this is going to be profound, and so we're all going to say this is something really profound. But she described in great detail, I won't go through it all, we've talked about it, of going through, they had that upper part of the temple divided into curtained off rooms, and they're going through these rooms, and people are acting out their version of the creation story and the fall, and Satan comes and tempts them. And she goes, and it was all just kind of silly to her. It was just a silly play, right? I'm just watching a bad play. And they came to her and taught her the grips and the tokens and the signs and whispered her new name in her ear. And I find it fascinating. She gave all of these details about the endowment, but she didn't give what her new name was. I'm like, why didn't you tell us that? You told us everything else. But she didn't tell that. At the end, everybody who had just gone through, they gathered in a room, and Heber Kimball came in to explain what they had just seen. And Kimball said, do you understand all of these signs that you just learned? And they said, nope. So he explained them by placing his right thumb, and these were some of the signs they were taught. He placed his right thumb under his left ear and drew his hand across his throat and said, this means you'll have your throat cut from ear to ear if you divulge anything you've seen or heard in the temple. He then drew his left hand across his breast, saying, this signifies you must have your heart taken out. And immediately after, he thrust his right arm down his right side, but did not explain. And I afterwards learned it signified the ripping open of the bowels, the tearing out of the entrails, and the mangled body being thrown into the river. Are not these hard sayings, said he? You're bound to obey the heads of the church, to avenge the blood of your brethren in every way possible, and strive to build up the kingdom. And if you do not, you must suffer the penalties before mentioned. So harsh. And it's worth pointing out, all of those symbols and signs, largely which were taken from Masons, a lot of that early symbology in the endowment ceremony, it remained until the mid-90s before it was removed as part of the endowment ceremony because people didn't like all the blood and guts and gore anymore. So she went through all of that. She was not impressed. Afterward, Kimball again approached her about becoming one of his wives. This was the conversation they had. She said, how do you feel now that you've had the endowment? How do you feel about matters now? And she says, I still have no evidence that it's right. And Kimball said, it's all right. I feel right toward you, and so does my wife. And when this altar is done and the sealing will commence, my wife will come forward and give you to me, and all will be right, for she likes you, and she will choose you for her associate. And I shall take you to be to the west in the first company, and you will always abide in my family, which will be a great blessing to you. And I have a number of women, but don't lodge with all of them. But the probability is I shall with you. How's that for a favor, right? I have a lot of wives. I don't stay with all of them, but you're going to be one of the lucky ones. Catherine was not impressed. Augusta Young came to her again to try to convince her to take a husband, and they had this conversation. Augusta said, I beg you not to leave, because she was afterwards, she's talking about leaving Nauvoo. She's very disillusioned. She said, don't leave without having your full endowment, meaning getting sealed and married. She said, I have no one to go through with. So Augusta named Kimball, Brigham Young, and a number of others, but to each of these I objected. She said, is there no one you will take? No, if I cannot be saved without it, I will be damned. And therefore you need say no more. So needless to say, she was very disillusioned by the endowment. She calls it a ridiculous farce and unable to accept polygamy. all of her things were still, they'd been shipped to St. Louis and hadn't arrived yet. So she went to St. Louis, and while she was in St. Louis, they wrote letters back to the church back in Boston, where she was returning, saying she was an apostate and not to have anything to do with her when she returned. So all that's to say, a lot of people loved the endowment and found it very moving, but a lot of people didn't and had similar experiences to what Catherine had. Also, not everybody was very good at keeping it a secret like you're supposed to. All those horrible penalties, but the reality was everybody, 5,000 people went through, right? And everybody was talking about it. And everybody was blabbing, and it ticked Brigham off. So much so that he shut down the temple for a whole day, right? When they didn't have many. And they're running 24/7 trying to get people through before they had to leave. He shut it down for an entire day and said, I've been saluted by people using the grips and the tokens, all the secret handshakes and everything they learned in the temple. I've had people walk right up to me and use those. I have felt to slap their faces. I don't like the dumbass that brays in the streets. And those who can't keep quiet will go quick to hell and be damned fourfold. And so he really didn't like people blabbing about what was going on in the temple and tried to put a lid on it. So there was a lot going on in Nauvoo in those last couple months. The saints had agreed to leave in April, but there were two things ultimately that happened that forced them to abandon Nauvoo much sooner than they had initially planned. The first thing was that indictments came down against Brigham and 7 of the apostles, accusing them of harboring a counterfeiting operation in Nauvoo. And there's some degree of debate on whether they really were or not. A man named Theodore Turley, who had just been named part of the Council of the 50, was also indicted. And this had been his living in England before he converted and came to the States. He had been trained in die casting and specifically making coins and coinage. And there's I think, fairly good evidence that he probably was involved, and he was part of this indictment. What isn't clear is whether Young and other church leaders had sanctioned the counterfeiting operation. If you read LDS apologists, they will all say this was all just cooked up to get them to leave sooner. And there's probably some degree of truth to that. They didn't want to give them till April. They wanted them gone. And so it's hard to know where the exact truth lies in all of this in terms of what level of counterfeiting the church was involved in or even knew about. Because they certainly did want them to leave, and they weren't above lying and doing false charges to do it. Whatever the case, the grand jury handed down indictments, and the apostles had to go into hiding to avoid arrest. And they showed up one day to serve a warrant on Brigham, who was gathered in the temple with the apostles. And the only way Brigham avoided arrest that day was they sent this guy, William Miller, out in Brigham's hat and coat. So he comes out of the temple and he climbs in Brigham's carriage. So they all assumed that was Brigham, and they go over and they arrest him and they haul him off to the neighboring town. And it wasn't until they got him there they eventually figured out they had arrested a bogus Brigham. They didn't have the right guy. It's interesting, William Miller, just interesting fact, he would go with the saints west. He would build the first permanent house ever in what is known as Provo today, and was part of settling that, was one of the first mayors of Provo and a city alderman for many, many years in Provo. So they avoided arrest, but this was part, right? The apostles are basically in hiding, and they're trying to avoid these indictments. And so that bumped up their necessity to move sooner. And additionally, Governor Ford told Brigham that federal troops in St. Louis were gathering and planning to intercept the Mormons when they did leave in April, and they were going to destroy them and wipe them out. And those rumors, which were circulating, weren't true. But Ford believed them and Brigham believed them. And so that led him to believe we have got to get out of town now. So rather than waiting until April, the public decision was made to abandon Nauvoo on February 2nd of 1846. The first group, which was the church authorities and their families, and a lot of those, right, facing indictment, left on February 4th. Brigham wouldn't leave until the 15th. And over the next few days, hundreds fled the city, crossing the Mississippi, and began to set up temporary camps in Iowa. Brigham's, when he crossed on February 15th, his contingent consisted of 15 wagons and 50 family members. Here's what I want you to think about. If that was all he had to be responsible for, can you imagine? What do you do? How do you get that from Nauvoo to Salt Lake City? If that's all you had, much less the responsibility of 10 to 15,000 other people who are going to try to make the same journey. And for some of these saints, if you think about it, some of them who've been with the church for a while have already moved from New York to Kirtland, where they had to leave Kirtland and flee to Missouri. They left Missouri to flee to Nauvoo, and now they're leaving again. And just about every time they start to get a little stability, everything falls apart. Most of them are very poor. February in Illinois is far different than April in Illinois in terms of weather. On February 24th, temperatures froze so solid that the Mississippi solid, which actually allowed people to leave a lot faster because they could cross over on the frozen ice. But by May, more than 10,000 of the saints had left Nauvoo and found them strung out all across southern Iowa. Think about what that would have been like for those people. George Canyon wrote this. He would go on to become, he worked in the first presidency with 4 different presidents of the church. He served, I think, 5 terms in the Utah legislature as a representative in Congress. He said, "Those of us who can remember when we were compelled to abandon Nauvoo when winter was so inclement know how dark and gloomy the circumstances of the saints were, with the mob surrounding our outer settlements and threatening to destroy us. The word was to cross the Mississippi and to launch out into an unknown wilderness, to go where no one knew. Who knew anything of the terrors of the journey thither or the dangers that might have been met and contended with?" My favorite account is this one. This is just so personal and so intimate. Bathsheba Smith said this. She was married to George Smith, a cousin of Joseph Smith and a member of the 12. She said, "My last act in that precious spot was to tidy the rooms, sweep up the floor for a house she's abandoning." There's such a sweetness to this that I tidied the room, swept the floor, set the broom in its accustomed place behind the door. Then with emotions in my heart, I gently closed the door and faced an unknown future. Faced it with faith in God. And so they are being forced to abandon Nauvoo. And if you just try to think about that in personal terms, like real families and real people, what that would have been like. By the end of the summer, less than 1,000 were left in Nauvoo. But the enemies of the church grew impatient with those who were still there. In September, a group of at least 700 men attacked the city. And for 3 days, the Battle of Nauvoo raged. And it was a real battle in every sense of the word, with cannons and gunfire on both sides. They shelled the city, who had just a few hundred men remaining at most. And so Nauvoo, they quickly surrendered and agreed to leave. The remaining Mormons agreed to leave immediately. So Nauvoo at its heyday, it was as big as Chicago, the biggest city in Illinois at the time, 12 to 15,000 people in the greater Nauvoo metropolitan area. And today, the population of Nauvoo today, or in the 2020 census, is 950. And it largely survives now. If you want to do an interesting drive, just go to Google Maps and drive around and look at Nauvoo. It largely survives today on LDS tourism. They've restored the temple and Brigham's home and Heber's home and Joseph Smith's store and a lot of those buildings. One of Heber Kimball's descendants started in the 1950s a lot of the restoration work, which has really taken off. But it's a little tiny town. It was abandoned and never really recovered. The temple that they had spent millions and millions of dollars on and thousands of hours of blood, sweat, and tears, the temple was set fire in 1848, and that destroyed pretty much all of the interior of the building except for the outer walls. A tornado knocked down the north wall and weakened two others. A French commune that moved in for a while hauled off most of the block in the other buildings. And so by 1853, after all of that work, when this sketch was made in 1853, this was all that was remaining of the temple in Nauvoo. But the question becomes then, for Brigham, is how do I get all of these people 1,300 miles from Nauvoo all the way to the Salt Lake Valley where they were planning on going? And I really think pulling that off, it's a fascinating story, but I think it's one of the great stories of the 19th century in American history, is how they were able to accomplish that. Writing about his plans, Brigham wrote to President Polk at the time, and he said this: "The cause of our exile, we need not repeat it. It's already with you. Suffice it to say that a combination of fortuitous, illegal, and unconstitutional circumstances have placed us in our present situation." And I just want to point out, he's not wrong. He's not wrong about that, right? Nothing about the way the saints were treated in Nauvoo was right. And Americans, we shouldn't treat each other that way. And it's hard to believe that we did. Nothing about that way they were treated was right. They placed us in our present situation on a journey which we designed shall end in a location west of the Rocky Mountains and within the basin of the Great Salt Lake or the Bear River Valley, which is Provo area, as soon as circumstances shall permit, believing that to be a point where a good living will require hard labor and consequently will be coveted by no other people. So we know it's going to be a lot of work to survive there. There's nobody else there, and we don't think anybody else is going to come. So we're going, and maybe they'll leave us alone. And it's surrounded by an unpopulous but fertile country. His initial plan in February was to get the saints here in 1846. And that was pretty ambitious. His plan was to initially send an initial vanguard of 300 people who would arrive in Salt Lake by spring of 1846 in time to plant spring crops so that when everybody else arrived that fall, right, there would be a harvest and there would be enough food for them to survive the coming winter. But it quickly became apparent that that wouldn't happen, mostly because he couldn't drag anybody along fast enough. He had ambitious plans of 20 miles a day and everybody can survive on half a plant of flour, and he had it all planned out. But he found out pretty quick nobody was going to be able to move that fast. And spring travel in Iowa proved to be pretty miserable. He wrote to Orson Hyde saying, "You've probably heard of the great mud hole which reaches from Nauvoo nearly to this place." And they did. They spent all spring just mired in mud and muck and cold and miserable, trying to get across Iowa with what they could carry. His plan for trying to do that was he developed a military-style organization where 50 family units formed one unit of travel. And then that 50 would be broken down into groups of 10. And each group of 10 had a captain who was in charge of that 10, and they were responsible for maintaining discipline and handing out camp chores and assigning duties and stuff. And Brigham called this company the Camp of Israel, and he was not hesitant in using Israelite motifs. They very much saw themselves as, and just like the children of Israel in exile from Exodus from Egypt, very much this is our Exodus to the west. And he wasn't shy about using that kind of imagery in talking about it. So throughout 1846, they straggled out of Nauvoo and across Iowa. Eliza Snow, one of Brigham's wives, and you're going to see her a lot more in the years ahead too. She wrote of a growling, grumbling, devilish, sickly time. And it was miserable. And you have accounts of people going, right, we're trying to camp and their tent is a sheet. and it's March and it's cold and it's muddy and it's miserable and a quagmire. And long story short, it was not pleasant. And very similar to Israel in the wilderness, it didn't take long until people began to complain about it and gripe and grumble. And there are a lot of similarities between the accounts because like Moses, Brigham got sick of it pretty quick too, of everybody griping and grumbling. And he lashed out against them going, hey, the time's come for these people when I will just command them what to do. Right? This whole process very much consolidated his leadership, and it shifted from, the 12 have control to Brigham has control pretty quick in this process. He threatened to slap those who wouldn't fall in line with a slap of revelation. People straighten up, and so it was frustrating. It was frustrating for him. I can't imagine the frustration. And there was frustrations from people who have nothing going, how come the 12 seem to be getting along so much, right? They have plenty of lumber to make a shelter for them. How come we don't? And those kinds of things. And so it was a tough time. But to be fair, Brigham was also very good about arranging provisions and making sure the people were provided for, especially for the poorest among them. He took the time to administer to the sick. Patty Sessions, who became well known in this period as a midwife delivering, right? There's pregnant women, right? How many pregnant women do you think there are in 10,000 people? I don't know, but it's more than a few, right? And so she became really well known in this whole migration west as a midwife and delivered a lot of babies. She had been a wife of Joseph Smith. She said, Brother Brigham blessed the people, and I felt his blessing even to the healing of my body, and I've been better ever since. So there was a sweet side to Brigham in all of this as well, I guess is what I'm saying. But they did very much see themselves as a modern-day Exodus, and they pointed to things like God parted the Red Sea for the Israelites to cross. He froze the Mississippi River for us so that we could get out of Nauvoo. There was a flock of quail that landed in the poor camp, and they very much saw that similar to the flock of quail in Exodus. And they pointed things like Brigham's appointing people over 150 and 10 like Moses had done. But they drew more than just encouragement from the story of the Exodus and the parallels. The thing is, they viewed themselves as the literal, that they had the literal blood of the Jews flowing in their veins, that they were God's literal chosen people. And the early LDS teaching was that, right? They were a restoration of the true Israel and the lost tribes. And so they very much believed they were literally Israel and God's literal chosen people. William Clayton wrote a hymn during this journey across Iowa in 1846 called Come, Come Ye Saints. And I just find it interesting of the mindset of the time. Two of the stanzas say, Why should we mourn or think our lot is hard? 'Tis not so, all is right. Why should we think to earn a great reward if we now shun the fight? Gird up your loins, fresh courage take, our God will never us forsake, and soon we'll have this tale to tell, all is well, all is well. We'll find the place which God for us prepared, far away in the west, where none shall come to hurt us or make afraid. There the saints will be blessed. We'll make the air with music ring, shout praises to our God and King. Above the rest, these words will tell, all is well, all is well. If the saints saw themselves as repeating the Exodus, they definitely came to view Brigham as their Moses, and that was not a comparison that Brigham discouraged. He encouraged the comparison, and he said at one point, I feel all the time like Moses. And I can kind of imagine that he probably did, trying to lead such a big group. Long story short, they were able to make it across Iowa. Eventually, that initial vanguard group made it to the Missouri River on the west side of Iowa, which borders Nebraska today, by mid-June of 1846, more than 2 months later than they anticipated. And they ended up settling there because they realized none of us are getting there this year. By then, it was too late, right? By the time they could have gotten to the Salt Lake Valley, it would have been fall and too late to plant any crops. So they made it this far and they realized this is as far as we're going to get. So they established 2 settlements, one on the east side, on the Iowa side, in what is Council Bluffs, Iowa today, and what came to be called Canesville, and then on the west bank near what is Omaha today, what came to be called Winter Quarters, which you may be familiar with. And that became the staging ground where everybody who's coming from Nauvoo kind of staged in Winter Quarters, and they would be there a year before that initial vanguard group could be sent the following year to make the trip out west. And the story of what happened at Winter Quarters is amazing enough in and of itself, and what they were able to throw together and how they survived that year while they're making plans for the rest of the journey west. And so we are going to pause there for today, and we'll pick up next Sunday with the story of Winter Quarters, which you won't want to miss. All right, so we'll see you there next week. Thank you for being here today. I can hang out for a few minutes if you have any questions. Have a good week.